A billionaire CEO bet me her $250,000 Bentley that I couldn't fix the Mercedes that 4 different shops had already given up on. She made that bet with a smile, so cold it could have frosted the windows of my garage. Standing there, in my leaky-roofed shop, in front of my 9-year-old son, wearing the exact kind of smile rich people reserve for someone they've already decided, is furniture that happens to know how to hold a wrench. I fixed that car with a part that cost $11. But I promise you right now, that $11 part is not the part of this story that matters. Not even close. What matters is what that fix bought my little boy, and what it did, months later, to the coldest, most armored woman I have ever stood across from in my entire life. And what happened to the man standing beside her, the one who thought he could bury me and walk away clean. My name is Denzel Washington. I'm 44 years old, and I fix cars for a living out of a 2-bay shop on the edge of Millbrook, Ohio, with a roof that drips into a bucket every time it rains hard, and my son's drawings taped up crooked all over the office wall. And the day a Bentley ended up signed over into my name was the day everything changed for the two of us. But not for the reason you're already guessing, not even close. Because before this story is over, somebody is going to lose a lot more than a car, and somebody else is going to lose everything they built on lies. But before I get to the bet, and the $11 part, and the thing that woman did at the very end that still makes my chest tighten when I think about it, do me one favor. If you've ever been looked at like you were nothing by somebody who never once in their life did an honest day's work with their own 2 hands, hit that subscribe button right now. This channel is built for people who get treated like furniture. Go on. I'll wait. Now let me tell you how this really started, which is the same place every single thing in my life starts. With my son. His name? Is Caleb. He's 9 years old, and he is the entire reason my bothers waking up every morning. And I need to tell you something about Caleb right up front, because without it, none of what follows will make any sense at all. Caleb is sick. I'm going to say it plainly, because I've learned over 3 hard years that tiptoeing around a thing like this never helps anybody, least of all the person carrying it. Caleb has a kidney condition, one that showed up quiet when he was a baby and got managed for years with medication and careful diets and a lot of prayer, and then, the way the doctors always warned it eventually might, it stopped being quiet. It got loud. Caleb needs a transplant, and until one becomes available, he needs dialysis 3 times a week, 4 hours at a stretch, in a chair in a clinic that smells like bleach and cold coffee, while I sit beside him doing math in my head that never once comes out in our favor. His mother left when he was 5. I won't stand here and tear that woman down, because Caleb is going to be old enough one day to find this video, and I will not have my son ever hear his father drag his mother through the mud. So I'll say it the gentlest way I know how. When the diagnosis came, when the real weight of it landed on both of us, some people find out they aren't built for the long, hard road. And the cruel thing is, they don't discover that about themselves until they're already standing at the start of it, staring at how far it stretches. One evening, she was at the dinner table. By the next morning, she was gone. It's been Caleb and me ever since, 3 years running, the two of us against something far bigger than either of us. So when people ask me why I take every job that rolls through my bay door, why I never once considered walking away from a wager that every sensible bone in my body was screaming at me to refuse, well, now you know the answer. His name is Caleb. He's 9. He draws pictures of the two of us fishing and tapes them to my shop wall where I'll see them all day long. And he needs a kidney. I cannot, on a 2-bay mechanic's income, even begin to help find faster, let alone pay the mountain of costs that come stacked on top of a transplant. That is the engine running underneath every single word I'm about to tell you. Keep him in your mind. I never once stopped keeping him in mine. Now, Let me tell you about the Mercedes. It came in on a flatbed on a Wednesday morning, towed because it wouldn't behave. It would start fine, idle rough, then drop into limp mode, which is when a car's computer essentially panics and throttles the whole engine down to protect itself from whatever it thinks has gone catastrophically wrong. The owner wasn't with it when it arrived. It came to me on a referral, a guy who knew a guy who said, "Take it to Denzel Washington. Last honest mechanic left in this county. He can fix anything with 4 wheels." And taped to the steering wheel was a fat stack of paperwork that told me the whole sad history of that car before I'd even popped the hood. 4 shops. 4 of them. 3 dealerships and 1 so-called specialist import garage across the state line. Every single one had done the exact same thing, thrown expensive parts and expensive labor at it, and shipped it back out the door, still broken. One had replaced the mass airflow sensor, didn't fix a thing. Another reflashed the entire engine computer, didn't fix a thing. A third had actually swapped out the fuel injectors, all 6 of them at a small fortune, didn't fix a thing. And the last shop, the big glass-fronted dealership downtown with the marble floor and the cappuccino machine in the waiting room, had finally thrown up its hands and written the magic words that let a shop off the hook completely. Recommend full engine control module replacement and possible wiring harness replacement as well. For all of that, they had quoted, and I am not exaggerating by one single dollar, $14,200. $14,000 for a car I would have bet my whole shop, before I ever laid a hand on it, had something small and stupid and cheap wrong with it. Because here's the truth about my trade that nobody respects until the day they desperately need it. The great majority of huge wallet-emptying car problems are actually small, cheap problems, wearing an enormous, terrifying costume. Those 4 shops weren't full of stupid men. They were full of fast men. That's the whole difference, and it is everything. They plugged the car into a computer, read the code it spat out, replaced the specific part the code pointed a finger at, and when that didn't fix it, they escalated straight to the most expensive possible answer on the menu. Because the most expensive answer is the one that turns the problem into somebody else's wallet and gets the car out of their bay by Friday. What none of them did, what almost nobody in my whole industry bothers to do anymore, and it genuinely breaks my heart, is the slow, boring, humble work of actually listening to the car, of chasing the problem back to where it truly lives, instead of just where the flashing light on the dashboard claims it lives. So that slow, boring, humble work is exactly what I did. I spent 2 full days with that Mercedes, squeezing it in between paying jobs, with Caleb parked at the desk in my office doing multiplication homework and wandering out every 20 minutes to hand me confidently the exact wrong tool and tell me, in enormous detail, about a video game level he was stuck on, trace the rough idle, the limp mode, and most important of all, the intermittent nature of the whole mess. It would act up, then run clean for a while, then act up again. Everything pointed gently toward the air-fuel mixture being off, but every single sensor I tested came back clean. So I went smaller, and then smaller still. On the afternoon of the 2nd day, flat on my back on a creeper, a flashlight clenched in my teeth, an inspection mirror in my hand, I finally found it. A vacuum line. One thin rubber hose about the width of a pencil, tucked behind the intake manifold in a spot nobody ever thinks to check because it's an absolute pain to reach. And it had a hairline crack in it, maybe 1/4 of an inch long, in cheap, aging rubber. Here's the beautiful, simple, infuriating logic of it, the thing 4 separate shops never caught. When the engine warmed all the way up, the heat made that rubber expand, and the expansion pulled the crack open just enough to let the engine start sucking in extra, unmetered air the computer wasn't tracking. That threw the whole fuel mixture out of balance. The computer, sensing chaos, panicked and dropped the car into limp mode. Then, when the engine cooled back down, the rubber contracted, the crack sealed itself shut, and the car ran perfectly fine again, which is the exact and entire reason the fault was intermittent, and the exact and entire reason 4 shops chasing computer codes had never once laid eyes on it. A cracked vacuum line. That's all it ever was. The replacement hose cost me $11 at the parts counter down the road. The labor took about 25 minutes, most of it just reaching the blasted thing. A $14,000 problem, according to the experts. An $11 fix, according to the truth. I didn't trust it right away. I never do. I drove that Mercedes for a full day, to be certain. Got it hot, sat in stop-and-go traffic on purpose, which is exactly where limp mode loved to rear its head. And it ran smooth as glass the entire time. Only then did I call the number on the paperwork to say the car was finally, truly ready. And that's the moment I found out exactly whose Mercedes I'd been lying under for 2 days. She swept into my little shop the next afternoon. Like the whole building ought to feel grateful she'd graced it with her presence. Vivienne Calloway. And if you follow business news at all, you might know that name, because she was the CEO of a massive logistics and freight conglomerate, headquartered 2 states over. The kind of company whose trucks you've passed 1,000 times on the highway, without ever thinking twice about who was steering the empire behind them. She ran it, from what I'd later learn, like a scalpel. Precise, merciless, and absolutely nothing left to chance. Everything about her was massive. The coat, the watch, the way she held her chin like the room owed her an apology just for existing before she arrived in it. She had that particular kind of presence you only get from being told you're brilliant by so many people who want something from you, that eventually you just stop checking whether it's still true. She wasn't alone. Standing half a step behind her was a tall, silver-templed man in a suit that cost more than my truck, introduced simply as Harrison Vale, her fiancé. And, as I'd come to understand far too slowly, the man quietly circling her fortune like a shark circles a life raft. Vivienne took one long look around my shop, at the leaky roof, at Caleb's drawings taped crooked across the wall, at my coveralls with Denzel's stitched over the pocket in faded red thread. And I watched her file me away instantly and completely into the drawer where people like her keep people like me. So, she said, not even really looking at me, scrolling through something far more important on her phone. The neighborhood garage believes it succeeded where trained professionals failed 4 separate times. Do tell, what was it? And I would be honest if I were you, because I absolutely will have this independently verified. So I told her, plain and simple, a cracked vacuum line, $11. I told her the dealership's $14,000 diagnosis had been wrong from top to bottom, that there had never been anything at all wrong with her engine computer, that 4 separate shops had simply chased flashing codes in circles, instead of taking the time to find where the problem actually lived. And she laughed at me. Not a real laugh, a small, cold, disbelieving exhale through the nose. The kind of laugh that's really a door slamming shut. She informed me there was simply no possible way that a problem 4 certified master technicians across 4 separate world-class facilities had quoted $4,000 to repair had in reality been an $11 rubber hose discovered by. And here she lifted one hand and gestured at my whole life, at the leak, at the drawings, at me. This. She decided, right out loud, to my face, that I was therefore either lying or simply incompetent, that I had most likely just reset the computer and gotten lucky, and that the exact same failure would come roaring back within the week. Harrison, standing behind her, actually smirked at a working man in his own shop, like he was watching a dog attempt long division. Now, I should have just let her pay the bill and climb back into her perfectly running Mercedes and drive out of my life. That's what the tired, sensible part of me wanted to do. But my Caleb was sitting right there in the office doorway, 9 years old, feet swinging, watching this glittering stranger and her smirking fiancé look at his father like something unpleasant, scraped off a shoe. And I think that, more than my own pride, is exactly why I said what I said next. Ma'am, your car is fixed. I'll stake my whole reputation on it. Drive it as hard as you like, for as long as you like, and it will run perfect, because I found the actual problem, which, with respect, is more than 4 shops and every certified professional between them ever managed to do. And that right there is the moment she made the bet. I believe to this day, she meant it purely to humiliate me. She was so completely bone-deep certain of herself, so used to being the smartest, richest, most untouchable person in every room she ever walked into, that she genuinely could not conceive of a universe where the grease-stained man in the leaking garage was right, and her gleaming dealership network was wrong. She fixed me with that cold little smile and said it loud enough for my son to hear every word. Very well then. I'll drive this car for 30 days. If your little $11 miracle holds and absolutely nothing goes wrong, I will sign over my Bentley. The one sitting in my private garage, worth considerably more than this entire building, and everything breathing inside it, very much including you. And if it fails, when it fails, you will refund me every cent I've paid across every shop, and you will hang a sign in that filthy front window declaring, in plain words, that you are not qualified to touch German or British engineering ever again. Do we have a deal? Harrison actually laughed out loud this time, delighted, already tasting my humiliation like it was dessert. It was a cruel bet, designed top to bottom, to make me stammer, to make me back down, to put the small man right back in the small place she believed he belonged. In her mind, that Bentley was never actually at risk. It was a prop, a stage light she waved around precisely because she could not imagine, even for a second, ever losing it to a man like me. But I had just spent 2 days flat on my back underneath that car. I knew exactly what I'd found. And I had a 9-year-old boy behind me who needed a kidney I couldn't find, and a mountain of medical bills I couldn't climb. So I looked Vivienne Calloway dead in the eye, put out my hand and said, "Deal." She shook it with the tips of 2 fingers, like she didn't want the grease on my palm to reach her skin, and drove off in a flawlessly running Mercedes, absolutely certain she'd just baited a fool into a trap of his own making. The month that followed was one of the hardest of my life. Not because I doubted the car for 1 second. I didn't. It was hard because Caleb had a rough stretch right in the middle of it. 2 nights in the hospital, monitors beeping, a young nephrologist using careful, gentle words that reminded me with brutal clarity that the clock ticking inside my son's body was not going to politely wait around while I scraped together $14,000. Let alone the transplant costs stacked on top of it. I sat in a hard plastic chair beside his bed, listening to him breathe, doing the same math I did every night. Math that never once came out right, no matter how many ways I turned it over. And for the first time, I let myself think about that Bentley sitting under lights in a private garage, 2 states away. I didn't think of it as a toy or a trophy or some rich woman's prop. I thought of it as a number. I thought of it as my son's second chance at a working kidney and a life that stretched past the walls of a dialysis clinic. The Mercedes ran perfectly, of course, all 31 days of that month. Not one hiccup, not one stumble of limp mode. The hose held, because a correctly diagnosed and correctly installed $11 hose was every last thing that car had ever actually needed. And here is where things took the first sharp turn nobody saw coming. Because 31 days later, Vivienne Calloway did not come alone, and she did not come to pay up quietly. She came with Harrison at her side, and she came with a lawyer, and she came with a look on her face that had shifted from cold contempt into something far uglier. Cornered, and furious about it. "There's been an error," she said, before I'd even said hello. "My legal counsel informs me that a verbal wager of this nature, made in a place of business, involving an asset of this value, is entirely unenforceable. I owe you nothing beyond the original invoice." I stood there, wiping grease off my hands, and I felt something in my chest go very still and very quiet. Not surprised, exactly. Just tired, in the deep way you get tired when the world confirms something ugly about itself that you'd hoped, one more time, it might not. "You shook my hand," I said. "I shook the hand of a mechanic who overstepped himself," she snapped, and beside her, Harrison actually smiled. That same smirk from a month before, except now there was something colder underneath it, something calculating, like he'd been the one steering this whole reversal from the start. And he had. That part I wouldn't learn until later, but I'll tell you now so you're not waiting on it the way I had to. Harrison Vale wasn't just Vivienne's fiancé. He was a man drowning in gambling debts he'd hidden from her for 2 years. A man who had already begun quietly siphoning funds out of her company's supplier accounts through a shell vendor he controlled, and a man who had seen, the moment his fiancé made that ridiculous bet in my shop, an opportunity to make her look reckless and unstable in front of her own board, the first crack he needed to eventually force her out and seize control of company assets himself, assets he desperately needed to cover the hole he'd dug. Making her renege on the bet publicly, making her look cruel and litigious toward a small town's single father, was step one of painting her, quietly, to the board, as erratic and bad for the company's image. He wanted her weakened, he wanted her doubted, and he was using me to do it. I didn't know any of that yet, standing in my shop that day. All I knew was that a woman who'd shaken my hand was now standing in front of my son's crayon drawings, telling me our deal never happened. "Ma'am," I said, keeping my voice level for Caleb's sake, because he was in the doorway again, watching. "I don't need a lawyer to tell me what a handshake means where I come from, but I imagine you'll be hearing from mine." I didn't have one. Not really. Just a cousin who'd passed the bar and did wills on the weekend. But I said it anyway, because sometimes all you've got left is your spine, and I wasn't going to let her watch it bend in front of my kid. She left with her lawyer and her smirking fiancé, and I stood in that shop, feeling like the floor had opened up under 3 years of exhaustion all at once. But here's the thing about small towns, and about honest work, and about crayon drawings taped to office walls. Word travels, and it travels in directions rich people never bother to imagine, because they've stopped believing ordinary people talk to each other at all. The story got out. Not from me, I want to be clear. I never said a word to a single soul outside my own kitchen table, but from the tow truck driver who'd delivered the Mercedes, and from the parts counter guy who'd sold me the $11 hose, and thought the whole thing was the funniest, most righteous story he'd heard in a decade, and from a local reporter who covered small business for the county paper and smelled a story about a billionaire welching on a handshake deal with a single dad, raising a sick kid alone. It ran 2 weeks later, small piece, local paper, nothing national. But it had a photograph of Caleb's crayon drawing in it, the one of him and me fishing, and a headline that didn't pull a single punch. Local mechanic solves $14,000 problem for $11. CEO refuses to honor own bet. It got picked up, not by choice of mine, by the sheer ordinary gravity of a story that made people furious on my behalf. Within a week, it had climbed onto a business blog, then a bigger one, then a national outlet doing a piece about corporate accountability and broken promises to small business owners. Vivienne Calloway's name, a name that had opened every door in every room she'd ever walked into, was suddenly attached, publicly, to the word welcher. And that is exactly the moment her carefully hidden board of directors started asking questions. Not about the bet, about her judgment, about whether the woman steering their nine-figure company was, in fact, as sharp and untouchable as her reputation claimed, or whether cracks were beginning to show. Harrison, I'd learn, fed those questions quietly to two board members he'd been cultivating for months, framing the whole embarrassment as evidence Vivienne was losing her grip. He had, in other words, built himself a lever, and he was one hard push away from using it to force her out of her own company. At which point, with her out and him positioned as the calm, steady hand the board could trust to stabilize things, he intended to quietly restructure certain vendor contracts, the ones running through his shell company, before anyone thought to look too closely at where the money had actually been going for 2 years. I didn't know any of this. All I knew was that 3 days after that article went national, Vivienne Calloway walked back into my shop alone, without her lawyer, without her fiancé, and without one shred of the ice she'd worn like armor the first time I ever laid eyes on her. She looked, for the first time, like a person instead of a headline. She set the Bentley's keys down on my counter, without a word. Beside them, the signed title. Every line filled out correctly. Then she stood there a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice had none of that razor left in it. I looked like a fool, she said quietly, and I deserved to. I shook your hand and I broke my word, and the entire world got to watch me do it because I underestimated a man I decided wasn't worth being honest with. She looked up at me. Why didn't you go to the papers yourself? You'd have had every right. Didn't have to, I said. Truth has a way of finding its own way out the door, ma'am. I've learned not to chase it, and that's when something flickered behind her eyes. Not gratitude yet. Not quite. But something close to disbelief, the same disbelief I'd have imagined you'd feel discovering gravity works a little differently than you'd been told your whole life. Then she asked the question that changed everything. Whose drawing is that? She was looking past my shoulder now, at the wall, at the one I'd never been able to bring myself to take down. Caleb, small, sitting in a hospital chair with tubes drawn carefully in crayon, and beside the chair a stick-figure man with brown hair holding his hand, and above it all, written in a 9-year-old's careful, wobbly letters, me and Dad, strong. Vivienne Calloway went completely still, I told her. All of it. About Caleb's kidneys, about dialysis 3 times a week, about a transplant list that moves slower than any parent's heart can bear, about a mother who stood at the start of that hard road 3 years ago and discovered she couldn't walk it. And I told her why a man takes a stranger's cruel, humiliating bet without blinking. Because to me, from the very first second, that Bentley was never a trophy. It was a kidney fund. It was time. It was every single dollar it would bring, headed straight for the one place it was always meant to go. The silence that filled my shop after. That was the loudest thing I have ever heard in my life. Her eyes filled up. She put one hand over her mouth, and all that armor I had so completely assumed was steel. All the way down turned out to be a shell after all, with a frightened person hiding somewhere underneath it. Because here is the thing about Vivienne Calloway I didn't know that day, the thing I'd only learned slowly over the following months. She had clawed her way up from nothing. A childhood of instability, a father who gambled away rent money, a promise she made herself at 12 years old that she would never again be powerless, or poor, or overlooked as long as she lived. She built her armor plate by plate. And somewhere in the building of it, without ever once meaning to, she'd become the very thing that had once frightened her. Someone who looked straight through people the way the world had once looked straight through her. She didn't say much else that day, but she came back the next week, and the week after. At first, I assumed guilt. I nearly told her to keep it. That my boy and I weren't a project for her conscience, but it wasn't pity driving her back. That was the thing that slowly knocked me off balance. She'd quietly, without a word to me until it was already moving, used every connection she had left standing to get Caleb's case reviewed by one of the top pediatric nephrology teams in the country and pushed his file to the very front of a transplant evaluation list that had been crawling along for over a year. She was careful, almost fierce, about never simply writing a check, because somewhere along the way she'd understood I would never accept a handout. Instead, she opened a door I could never have opened myself and got my son seen, truly seen, by people who could actually help him. She kept showing up after that, swinging by the shop in the late afternoons after Caleb got home from school. At first he was shy of this tall, sharp-dressed stranger who smelled like something expensive. Then, because my son has never once in his whole life met a person he considered a stranger for longer than 4 minutes, he started dragging her over to the crayon wall to explain, at enormous and occasionally inaccurate length, exactly how carburetors work. One afternoon I walked out of the bay wiping grease off my hands and stopped dead in the doorway, because there was Vivienne Calloway, CEO, worth more than my entire zip code combined, sitting on an overturned 5-gallon bucket in a very expensive blazer, locked in a deeply serious negotiation with a 9-year-old over whether the Cleveland Browns were ever going to win a Super Bowl in his lifetime, and losing that argument badly, and not seeming to mind one bit. Meanwhile, Harrison Vale's carefully built lever was about to snap back on him with everything he had coming, because the same reporter who'd broken the original bet story kept pulling on the thread, the way good reporters do, and in following the money behind Vivienne's sudden public humiliation, she found something Harrison had never imagined anyone would look for. A shell vendor, registered 2 counties over, receiving inflated invoices from Vivienne's own logistics company for freight services that, on closer inspection, had never actually been performed. 2 years of it. Nearly $3 million quietly bled out through Harrison's careful paperwork while he smiled at Gallus on Vivienne's arm and whispered doubts about her judgment into the ears of board members he'd been grooming to replace her. The story broke like a dam giving way. Federal fraud investigators got involved within days. Harrison Vale was arrested at his own office in front of the very board members he'd spent months courting and led out in handcuffs past secretaries who'd once feared crossing him. The engagement ring came off before the police car had even left the parking lot. Vivienne herself dropped it into an evidence bag the investigators offered her, her hands shaking, not from grief, but from the particular fury of realizing she'd been played as thoroughly as she had once played the world. He was eventually convicted on multiple counts of wire fraud and embezzlement and sentenced to 11 years in federal prison. He lost the company standing he'd schemed for, the fortune he'd been quietly stealing to protect, and the woman he'd been using as a stepping stone the entire time. He lost everything in the end, trying to take everything from someone else. And every single dollar of that stolen $3 million was eventually clawed back and returned to the company, restoring exactly the stability Harrison had tried to convince the board Vivienne herself was incapable of providing. Vivienne, meanwhile, did something I don't think anyone who'd known her for the last 20 years would have predicted. She didn't retreat. She didn't hide from the embarrassment of the bet, or the humiliation of the engagement, or the mess in the papers. She stood up in front of her own board, told them the entire truth about everything. The wager, the reneged handshake, Harrison's fraud, all of it, and asked them to judge her not on the worst month of her adult life, but on what she chose to do next. What she chose to do next was rebuild her company's public reputation from the ground up, starting with an initiative that funded medical costs for the families of small business employees and independent contractors who worked with her logistics network, nurses, dock workers, drivers, and yes, mechanics. Anyone whose kid, like mine, was fighting something bigger than a paycheck could ever cover. She named it, over my strong objection, and my son's absolute delight, the Caleb Fund. Caleb's transplant happened that spring. I'm going to say that once more, slowly, because there are still mornings I wake up and can hardly believe I get to say it at all. My son received a healthy kidney, and today, right now, as I'm telling you this, he is strong, and he is loud, and he is absolutely certain the Browns are winning it all next year, and he is going to grow all the way up. The money from the Bentley, because, yes, I sold it exactly the way I always intended to. Covered the piece of the transplant costs, insurance, dug its heels in, and refused to touch, and it bought us the kind of breathing room a single father scraping by never gets to have. And Vivienne was right there in that surgical waiting room with me through the entire thing. Not as anything official yet. We hadn't put words on what we were to each other. Just as a person who plainly could not have imagined being anywhere else in the world that day. She held my hand through the longest hours of my life and didn't fill them with empty, comfortable noise, because by then she'd finally learned the one lesson all her money had never once taught her. That simply showing up and staying and being quiet beside someone in the dark is worth more than anything a person can buy or steal. We were married a little over a year later. Small ceremony at the shop of all places, with the roof finally fixed, her one absolute non-negotiable demand that she be allowed to pay for that repair, and after everything, I finally let her have it. Caleb stood up front and held the rings, grinning so wide I thought his face might crack, in a suit he picked out himself and refused all help with. Here's the thing I turn over in my mind more than any other part of this story. Vivienne Calloway had every single thing money could ever buy a person, and she was one of the loneliest, most walled-off human beings I've ever met. And the thing that finally, after decades, cracked all the way through to her wasn't a grand gesture or a bigger fortune. It was a 9-year-old's crayon drawing taped to a leaking wall, and a tired man who kept his word for the only reason worth keeping it. And Harrison Vale, the man who tried to use my honesty as a weapon against her, who smirked at a working father in his own shop and thought cruelty was the same thing as power. He's sitting in a federal facility right now with 11 years to think about exactly how much he lost trying to take something that was never his to take. I'll never be a rich man myself, and marrying into that kind of fortune changed almost nothing about how I actually work. I still roll up that bay door every morning. I still find the cracked $11 hose instead of selling some frightened stranger a $14,000 problem they don't actually have. Because that's exactly who I am. And because my son is always watching how his father does things. There's a version of this story where I let that cruel bet turn me bitter, where I let a woman's broken handshake convince me the world really is as cold as it looked that first day. And there's simply no version of that story where my son ends up with a mother who fought for him like her own life, depended on it, where a fraud gets exposed before it can do any more damage, and where a hard, frightened woman gets her own buried heart handed back to her, right when she needed it most. I pick telling the truth. I'd pick it every single time. I leave you with this thought tonight. Never write someone off before you know what cracked their shell, and always watch out for the smiling danger hiding beside the one everybody warned you about. The truth always finds its way out the door eventually. If this story got to you tonight, hit that subscribe button if you haven't yet. Drop a like so the next person can find their way here, and leave your own experiences in the comments below. I'll see you in the very next one. Trust me, it's a good one.